12 months and a pile of old wood that I ripped off my front porch. Is it going to float? Stick around to the end and find out. So I finally finished my boat video. I started this May 5th, 2022, so it's going on exactly 50 weeks. 2 or 3 weeks will be 1 year. I'm really happy it's done. I want to say a huge thank you to Carolina Shoes for supporting me and many of the other makers in this community. We get to do what we want to do and we get to promote Carolina Shoes. So Carolina, thank you very much. Also, Total Boat has been a huge help with the resins and the epoxies and the mesh and the finish, and also Type Bond. So thank you guys. And of course, Bear Mountain Boats, who provided me with the plans to make this boat. I'll remind you, this boat is predominantly made out of my old deck boards from the front of my house, from the restoration I did on my front porch. I was able to recycle all this very, very old Doug fir, beautiful grain, instead of throwing it away. It was a really big win for me. I just want to say thank you for following along. And if you haven't seen part 1, I'll put the link right at the top of the description. Go back and watch part 1 of this boat build. Thank you for the love and support. I appreciate it. This is the Lake Skiff. I actually built this second. At the back of this video is my canoe, which I built first. These are the plans for the Lake Skiff. These are the paper plans designed by Steve Killen for Bear Mountain Boats. And with these plans is everything I need to know to build this boat. I first saw this boat when I was up in Canada. I was at an event, Maker Rendezvous, that Bear Mountain Boats held together. My friend Joan kicked off the Maker Rendezvous just before COVID, so we haven't had a second one. But at that, there was a rendezvous of boats on the lake. And I saw somebody with this beautiful little rowboat. It had a little motor on the back. And I said, I need to make one of those. So I got the plans in the fall of 2019. And of course, life gets in the way. And I want to make it right away. But it wasn't until May of this year that I actually began to make it. Now, if you were the average purchaser, you could buy the stations, or you can buy the plans and make the stations yourself with the plans. But they don't typically give out the CNC files. Steve gave them to me because of the video component that I was doing here. But they would provide the CNC'd boat stations for you. But I think they just don't want the plans to be emailed around for free. So that's why they're not provided to the general public. And I took a few sheets of plywood on the ShopBot CNC. A little history lesson. The ShopBot CNC was started by the owners of ShopBot because they were making boat stations. So they were very excited to see me making boat stations again on the same CNC machine. This is the same machine that I used when I made the Canoe. And the Canoe was also a Bear Mountain Boats set of plans. The difference between the Canoe and this Lake Skiff, or this 13.5-foot rowboat, is this is going to have a flat back, and I was given the wood for the Canoe, and the wood consisted of cedar strips with the cove and the cove, so that one piece could fit snugly into the other regardless of the angle of incidence. This is the same strong back I used for the Canoe, obviously, and I gave Paul Jackman the boat stations for the Canoe. So hopefully Paul will make a Canoe. He has the same boat stations that I used, but I kept the strong back knowing that I was going to make another boat. Strong back's obviously just made up out of plywood, and so now these are the boat stations all going in, the mold stations going in order. Again, another difference between the mold stations between this and the Canoe is the mold stations of the Canoe were the same from the center left and the center right. These are all individually different because this boat has a continuously different shape from one end all the way to the front. The Canoe is basically mirrored from the center left and center right. And here, this is going to be the mold for the stem, and you'll see me making the stem shortly. Now, I put those pieces in between because these boat stations got pretty big and they were a bit floppy-doppy, so I wanted to just put that in there. Now, many of you guys remember a few videos back, I redid my deck in the front of the house. And this is much of the wood. There's a lot of it. There's a few truckloads. And here you could see my friend Brooke pulling all the wood up off of the deck. Now this wood was installed maybe 100 years ago, and at the time it was cut down, it was probably a couple 100-year-old trees. But here you can see up close the wood with all the lead paint on it. And this wood is Doug fir with a very, very, very tight grain pattern because it's such old growth wood. It is actually incredible. In just a small, maybe at 1 inch, there's 50, 60 grain patterns, which is incredible. It's all quarter sawn. And so the fact that I saved this was actually, I pat myself on the back because for a minute I was just going to throw it right in the fire as we were ripping it off the deck just to get rid of it, but I saved it all, and I have all the rest of it as well. So here we're prepping it. Joey pulled the nails out. That's my brother Joseph, my oldest brother. I'm the third of 3 boys, the third youngest, and then my sister is younger than me. Now here you see me preparing the wood that's going to be the stem. And I'm using the newer wood that I used on the deck. This is leftover planks for the modern version of the front porch of my house, the deck on the front porch. This is the red grandis or the eucalyptus that I used. Obviously I got a lot of leftovers, so I used it up on the boat here. I'm making thin strips. Now I could have steam bent this, but since the strips were so thin, I didn't need to steam bend it, and I'm using my old trusted Type Bond number 3, which gives you a lot of open time, and it dries dark, which I like, and it's also waterproof, water resistant, I don't know, whatever you call it. But there you see, now I'm bending this around the mold station there, or that's the stem mold, and that's why we needed those holes. Those holes provide the clamping pressure. But you notice how I tape one end together and the rest is left loose. Now I could have steamed this, but I didn't think it was necessary because it was all bendy enough. Now if that was a short bend, and I probably would have had to steam it. But here I glued it, bent it, and left it. And now once this dries, I need to make the outer stem. That's the inner stem. Now I'm also making the backer, or the transom, the back of the boat. This is going to be the back of the boat. So at one end the planks get glued to the transom, and all the way at the other end they get glued to the stem, which all still needs to be shaped. So I'm just making up my block. So while that glue dries, I go back over to the stem and I prepare it a little bit. This needs plenty of shaping. I'm just getting rid of the glue so that I could make the outer stem. And I threw them all through the saw, and now I'm just planing them all a little bit just to give them a little bit more pliability. And this red granite is a little, it's a little heavy, and it's also not extremely flexible. It's a little brittle. It's kind of almost like it's like a teak in a way, which isn't really meant to be bent all that much. But in small, thin laminates, it's obviously thin enough to bend. And you see here I'm putting those blocks of wood on there because when I clamped, that last piece still wanted to go straight. So those clamps provided pressure across the whole width of the laminate. Because if I just used just the clamp itself, it was pushing down in the middle and the wood was kind of butterflying up around the clamp. And so everything is nice and tight. Now this is May. I began this build in May, and now here it is December. So May, June, 7 months. If you're going to build a boat, devote a lot of time and devote a space that you can devote a lot of time to that space as well. Now this is the transom, and you'll see here I kind of had to layer it a little bit to make it a little bit wider. That last mold station is the transom. And so I use it as my shape. And now that's the shape at the top, so I'm just using a little piece of flexible wood. And I'm using my big giant bandsaw. And once I put the transom in place, I have to make all the curves fair. So you see it's obviously perfectly square to the table of the bandsaw. But now you'll notice I'm using one of these rasps. You can get that at Rockler Woodworking. It's a great rasp. It's a Shinto, I think it's called. It's like almost a bunch of hacksaw blades all riveted together, and it could pretty much cut anything. There's a fine side and a rough side. So I took the Shinto and I added a long piece of wood. So the long piece of wood is riding the next station. So I'm getting the angle transferred. So now if you're a long strip of wood, the long strip of wood is going to come along all the stations and then fair curve right into the transom. Now this is me pulling off the outer stem, which then gets put to the side. That gets shaped much later in the process. That same concept that I did with the Shinto at the back, I'm going to have to do here as well. Now I'm pulling this off just to get it cleaned up. Now I have to keep taking it off and putting it back on. I want to make sure that I save my screw holes. Now I used my buddy Tony, made this hand plane for me, and I pretty much used it the entire build. Now I'm going back on there. So every strip from the back to the front is going to be glued to this. And there you see that same process. I have the rasp following the curves that would be made up if a strip of wood came around each one of those stations. And it's a tremendous amount of physical work, and it's you got to be devoted. And thank you to my Carolina boots to keeping me comfortable in the shop. My jam. And using the hand planes when I can, using the rasps when I can. And now I'm preparing the wood that is going to be the planks. Out of each one of these 1x4s, I get 4 1/4 by 1 inch pieces. Now the difference between this and cedar is much more flexible, and the other problem I had to deal with is the fact that each one of these boards is no longer than, I think the longest set of boards I had was 8 or 9 feet. So every single run front to back has a scarf joint in it. And there you see the paint coming off. And I set up a system here where all the planks were the same size and had the vacuum sucking up all the lead paint. And there's my brother on one side of the saw. I'm on the other side of the saw. Now I had a plan to make sure all the good clean wood faced out, and anything that had severe staining or paint or any kind of texture from the weather would face in, so that ultimately I could use all the wood facing in to create a reminiscent texture of where all this wood came from, because the inside gets a lot of woodwork. And right here you see this is a little jig I made because I knew I was going to have to make lots and lots of scarf joints, and I wanted to make sure that they would always be the same. So I set up this little jig so that the scarf joints would match. Sometimes I cut underneath that little piece of wood, and sometimes I cut on top of it, but it doesn't matter because it keeps giving me that same angle. And in some of the early planking, I glued up my scarf joints on the ground. So I would have myself a prepared 15-foot long strip. And here you see me doing that right now. And I use the weights from my strong hand table just to keep everything perpendicular while everything dried. Squeeze clamp. So I kept preparing long strips of wood over and over and over. I got to a point now where I couldn't really bend. Sometimes the wood got to a point where it had to bend so severely that those scarf joints kept breaking. And here you see me preparing these stations so that I don't end up gluing the entire boat to the stations. It's important to create some of these barriers. The most important thing with doing a boat is the stick-to-itiveness. I can't emphasize this enough, and I'll probably say it 10 more times in the next 30 minutes. If you are going to make a boat, you have to be fully dedicated. So if you decide you want to try and do this, just know that you need to devote a lot of time to it. If at the very least, think of it like exercise. Maybe a couple hours every other day, just so you can keep the project moving along. That is, I could tell, the biggest problem. A lot of people have half-built boats. It's just like a car restoration. By the way, you see I'm laying down the very first plank, and I use these various little hooks. I kept making these little hooks on the bandsaw to keep these parts in place. Now, this is the most important, gluing down the very first clamp, and you'll find all the various different jigs and ways to rig up clamping pressure You'll see there I have those little screw clamps. I have a set from Rockler, and I have a bunch of different ones from Jurgensen. Now you see that skinny little, I didn't realize that till I was right about here, and I was like, oh, I wish that wasn't so skinny right there in under the clamp. But whatever, I left it and it sanded right in. Nobody knows, can't see it. So the very first planks are the beginning. And now with my Type on 3, I'm starting to lay down new clamps and new planks. And you see I prepare the planks up in place over, and I have these little clips that I made. And these clips change shape a little bit throughout the build. And it's easy when you have 2 planks. You can just tape them together. And then when you start getting 4 and 5 and 6 and 10. Now this is when I don't have the bead in the cove like a typical, the wood that would be prepared, say, for the canoe if you were to buy your Bear Mountain Boats wood. Each plank has to be perpendicular, so I made this shoulder plane with a little guide on it so that it could ride along the stations. And it prepares any kind of twist and turn that that piece of wood might have, gets cut out of it so that I can get as tight as possible. Now I'm a little bit of a hack woodworker, but I did do the best I could to get each one of those joints as tight as possible to one another. And so every single board gets hand planed before it gets put next to the other board. And black tape, I learned from my friend Patrick, the electrician, Pat Reynolds, is extremely versatile. It's not just for electric. And I use it kind of like a thin, almost like a stretch wrap. And now you see here with this hand plane, the shoulder plane, works better on the pull than on the push. I can control it. And that guide has like a bullet, well, not yet. You see it doesn't have the bullet nose yet, because every time I use it, it kept banging my knuckles, and then I put a bullet shape on the end so it doesn't keep hitting the stations. And the way I attached that piece of wood to the shoulder plane was with CA glue, which just breaks right off later on. And this is very exciting. I'm starting to see some progress. I'm starting to see the curves. And again, there's that hand plane. I used this quite a bit until I ended up getting a different one later on. Then I went on Amazon and I found a different one. I'll show you that one when it comes up. Here I'm putting an accent. This is going to be just underneath the gunnels or the outrails. And this is a strip of Wenge. When I very first met Derek from Malden, my partner on the TV show, thank you Carolina Shoes. I dropped in some Carolina. These are really great, these Carolina boots. They kind of have this this durable toe, and I'm always down on my hands and knees. And so the toe doesn't wear out. They're great. Again, doing some more of this tape job. Later on, I have to I figure out a different method, which starts compressing, because once I get up and over that curve, the tape pressure is in a different direction. It doesn't necessarily pull it into it. It pulls it almost away from it. Now, this is probably a month in. I started very strongly. I started with a lot of gusto. And then got involved in a few other summer projects, building the barn in the backyard, and get a little bit sidetracked. But you see, it's important. I kept preparing the pieces I was going to glue just above it. Squeeze clamps are a huge part of this job. And I actually did something interesting with the squeeze clamp that holds the planks on the stem. I showed it on Instagram quite a bit. Thank you to my Suzanne Saw. Cezanne, links below. And now here you can see how that hand plane is matching the curve of the boat. But you'll notice a couple times where the planks were pulling off of the stations, I just put a piece of wood over it and threw a little air nail in there. And I wasn't overly concerned about holes and pinholes and stuff, because all this wood was used anyway. There's various nail holes in it all over it. And I wanted a lot of that texture to remain. I want you to be able to tell that this wood was something else first. As part of the transformation process. I find it quite beautiful to notice when you take a close look that this material is living its second life. So I came up with this idea, these just little CNC clamps, thank you ShopBot, and these little CNC clips just start to help me apply downward pressure. And those screw clamps, I do this technique, and again, I kind of showed more of these details on Instagram, but I screw clamp the tip, the tip of the screw clamp is grabbing the planks that are already glued, and I make them really tight, and then I shift them sideways. And by shifting them sideways, it puts pressure on the plank that is being glued to the existing plank. And there'll be more examples of that. Now, this is a new hand plane that I got on Amazon, and it's this sort of Japanese style shoulder plane, and it turned out to be really good. And now this is Tony's plane, so every plane gets a little chamfer, every plank going on gets a little chamfer, and every plank that's already there gets the chamfer with the little tiny Japanese shoulder plane. Now, those are my clips, and the reason I made them more beefy is because I'm clamping them very tightly, then I'm tapping on them so they push down directly into the plank below. Now you see I have these can't twist clamps, which are super strong. Those are the can't twists. And I put the plank in place, and then I go back in with a hammer and I tap them. And then because the twists got more and more severe as we went up the hull of the boat, I got these clamps that have the little pressure in the middle from Jorgensen. I saw them at Home Depot. They grab top and bottom, and then there's a third angle, so you have like almost X and Y as far as your clamping pressure. Now, the way you do it, you close up one side, and then you build your straight line down the middle, down the keel, and you close it in from the opposite side. And that's what I'm doing here. Now this, I'm trying to figure out what timeline this. I started in May. Now this is probably, this I think is in like September. And this is refreshing when I'm finally able to cut all these planks off that are at the very back of the stern. And that's exciting. One love to Type Bond. Type Bond's been very good to me, and they've been good to me my whole career. I've been using Type Bond since the very beginning. I'm happy we know each other now. And now I'm making some of the more severe curves, or the severe wedges that are closing up the bottom of the boat. So these long, severe wedges, I'm bandsawing them, and I'm hand planing them and shaping them to fit perfectly in place. Now I smudged a lot of glue to fill in cracks and stuff, so that's why it looks fairly messy. I used a lot of the glue to fill in some of the gaps. And this is what you see there. You see me. You got to make sure it fits in one end, and in some cases I was making it fit in one end, clamping it in place, doing whatever I could to get it to stay down, and then shaping the other end in place, because to try and get it to dry fit, and you get it to dry fit, and then it just seems right, and then when you go to glue it, it's too short. So it was a little difficult. So I was clamping one end and then dry fitting the other end, clamping with glue one end and then dry fitting the other end and getting it to fit. And I knew that I was going to put a keel down the middle of this, so if I had a little bit of gapping there, I wasn't going to beat myself up. So you could see all the tools in action that take place to try and close up the bottom. And you see, I couldn't make that severe bend without having those chocks that are right there. And that would be the whiskey plank where those chocks are. They call it the whiskey plank because you put it in, then you're so drained from doing this that you have to have a glass of whiskey. Nick sent me a message and said that he was sorry that he had missed the whiskey plank. But that was fine. Nick's always here with me in spirit. And so there you see how one end is glued. Now I'm confident I can get it banged in there. I'm also using that elevator weight. That yellow elevator weight is great to keep everything nice and pressed down on the stations. This Doug fir is not very pliable. It wants to go straight. And now this is my the whiskey plank. I'm making a nice severe cut on the table saw, freehanding it. And you see that tiny little piece is the whiskey plank. So this is always a big milestone. Very big. And I knew I was going to put a keel so I can cover any sins that was showing, but of course you want to try and do the best you possibly can. Now I started mentioning a squeeze clamp invention that I made for the front, which I don't think I explicitly show, but where the planks come to the very front of the stem, I sharpened both sides of a squeeze clamp so it grabs like fangs, so it pulls the front into the stem. So the squeeze clamp has fangs on it so it doesn't slip, because it's impossible to clamp when you're at the apex of a V. It's hard to clamp in that particular direction. So I'm using DFM's scraper here, getting all the lumps of paint and rather glue, getting all the lumps of glue off before I start shaping it. Now it's like 70% shaped. There's still a lot of beautiful curves to add to all the facets, and I use my Shinto a little bit. I use a little bit of hand plane, but I did early on with the hand plane, but I found the hand plane is dangerous because you can get some good chip out, especially on this. This isn't the soft cedar, this is the Doug fir. And when you throw the hand plane across grain of 6 or 7 planks, some cut perfectly, some get tear out. So you got to be super careful, and it's almost not worth it because I had to like replace some of the tear out, to be honest with you. And now here with the Shinto, I'm able to shape. I hope I'm calling it the right thing, but you guys know what that's called. Shinzo, Shinza, and this is a lot of work. I wish I had one of those 4 feet long. It would be a lot less knuckle banging. And I'm going across grain because I want one plank to smooth and chooch into the next grain, and using the scraper where I can, but then obviously the palm sander does the dirty work. But look at the physicality of this. I mean, it's so easy to walk away from this project, I'm telling you. But you got to be dedicated. You got to finish what you start. That's what I always say. So now I'm palm sanding, and I'm really seeing some good results here. It gets, good results beget good results. You start seeing some progress, and you're like, oh yeah, I like it. I like what I'm doing here. So when you get good progress, it's just nice. It helps you continue to go on and on. This has got to be the biggest POS belt sander I think I own, but it happened to be what was in the shop at that moment. It was when Craftsman decided to just give up and say, you know what, we're going to make tools, but we don't care at all. And that's what I happen to have. It seems like something you would buy in a grocery store, but my good one was at the other shop. And so now I'm preparing to install the outer stem. And the outer stem goes across all the end grain of the boards there until it eventually falls in between them, and I have to make that space. And this is my outer stem. I take it over here. I'm using Tony's hand plane there, Hillview wood and metal, and I flatten out one side of the stem that I made in the very beginning of May. Now here it is September, October, and it's ready. I'm ready for this part now. And like a jointer, I'm flattening out one side. I could have probably done this on the jointer, to be perfectly honest, but it wasn't that severe. So on one side, I hand plane it, and then I throw it through the table saw on the other side. So I start out with a nice regulated width that is what I need. And now I need to lay it into the planking. Now underneath there is the inner stem. And the inner stem goes from laying underneath the boards to laying in between them. It's part of the difficulty of making the boat. You get that roll of paper plans, but I did spend a lot of time on Google trying to find similar boats, trying to figure out what they did. Now, if you remember in the beginning, well, here I am. I'm putting screws in it now for the very first time. And it's important to put screws in it before you shape it. Obviously, you don't want to glue it yet. You certainly don't want to glue it, but you got to put the screws in it, and then you begin to shape it, because then you start to establish certain parameters where the edges meet and match. And so I pre-drill it, and then I put the screw in it. And then later on, when I'm ready to glue it, I use those same screw holes. And so here now I'm working on it pretty heartily with the hand plane, with what I can get. I can't get everything with the hand plane, but I do my best. I get most of it. And then this stem, it's fared into both sides on either side, but as it goes down towards the keel, it starts to pop up out of the boat. So it's a little bit of a difficult transition, and just take it slow and steady, and just constantly keep assessing your work and making sure you don't take off too much too fast. So you'll notice kind of like that right there, right, kind of like at my elbow height. Oh, thank you, Carolina Shoes. At my elbow height there, the sides fare directly into the nose. So now I got to take it off to continue to make some more fair curves on there. And I can put it back on the boat with those screws. So I had to take it off to get down at the very bottom, which was too close to the strong back. And now here I am, I'm making what's going to become the keel, which is the outer piece of wood that goes on the bottom right down the middle. Obviously gives the boat some strength and also gives it sort of like a fishtail across the bottom. But I thought I was going to be able to just shape it and put it right on there, but there's such a gradual curve along the bottom of the boat that I needed to turn this into several layers, just like I did the stem, so that I could lay it down and have it take the curve of the bottom of the boat. So I did several, and this is how I did it. I glued 1 to 1, let it dry. Then I glued 2 to 1, let it dry. Then I glued 3 to 1, let it dry. And so this was after a few days of building it up. And you'll notice how the shape of it goes from fairly thin to fairly fat at the end. Right there is the end where there's almost like a little fishtail that sticks out of the bottom of the boat. I'm sure it has a name, but I don't know what it's called. So you see all the various layers to create the different thicknesses all along the keel. This is a few days later. Now I'm shaping it. And I tried a couple of different techniques to shape it. And it's going to be tapered, so once it touches the boat, it's going to be at its widest, and when it comes up off the boat, it's going to get skinny. And so I shaped some of it on the table saw here. I just freestyle a lot of it, which is very dangerous because you could really take off more than you want to take off. And it's also dangerous because you can get hurt, but it's more dangerous because you're going to screw up too much, take off more than you need too fast. And so I said, you know what, let me be a little bit, play it safer, and I'm using my draw knife from Rockler Woodworking. That is an incredible draw knife that Rockler sent me. Not only is it razor sharp, it just has a really nice shape to it. It's got a really beautiful bevel, and if you're using your draw knife correctly, you could work that bevel to your advantage. Now this really long taper is not easy to do. You could easily screw it up. So I'm just using the hand plane, long, gentle strokes, and making sure that we're nice and chooched on the straight line of it all. Mixing up some Total Boat to glue down the keel, and I taped off where I don't want any glue. That goes right down the middle. It covers all my sins that I might have left when I was trying to put in the last couple of planks. And I put the glue I used the sawdust from the palm sander, and I put that in there. And there's a little scarf joint right where the outer stem meets the beginning of the keel. And I make sure everything's glued in place. And then I pre-drilled everything, so now I can go down and throw a screw right where everything goes. Really important. You don't want to be putting those screw holes in it while everything's got goo on it. You should get that on your tools, and things will be slipping around. So now it's probably the next day. I'm peeling the tape off, and now I'm going to shape that in a little bit. And I'm able to take off the stem and finally glue the stem. I'm gluing the stem in because I had a nice face match. Everything fit nice and tight, so I'm just using the tight bond here. And you can see that scarf joint where the stem meets the keel, and everything gets nice and glued into place. And at this point I was really starting to see, and then I went around and I patched in a bunch of pinholes with some epoxy with some sawdust in it. And now I'm shaping the stem a little bit more, getting it nice and fairly curved to the rest of the boat, and making sure, doing my best. A lot of looking down the barrel of the gun there, standing at one end of the boat looking down towards the front and vice versa. Now I'm really getting that bevel in nice and clean. I left a little bit of meat on the bone so that I could work it while it was in place. And here I am working with my long plane. And this, I started noticing when I was turning off various lights in the shop, rows of lights, I started to see little bumps and ripples from the palm sand. And so I made this long board to get rid of some of those. They were very subtle, but they were enough to drive me bananas, so I made this long board and spent hours. I just did a little clip here for YouTube, but I spent hours doing this, long boarding the boat. And I'm just walking by, and I feel it with my eyes closed, because you don't want any visual differences to give you an influence to thinking what you might be feeling. And now it's resin day. Now here it is, what is it, December. And I'm breaking open my resin cloth from Total Boat. Thank you, Total Boat. And this is fiberglass mesh. And if it was the Canoe, it might be enough to go for all the way from side to side. But since I had the keel down the middle and I wasn't able to, fiberglass is a funny material because it doesn't go around curves at all. It doesn't go around curves very well, I should say, especially tight, sharp curves. It'll pucker and not lay down flat. So there's no way I was going to be able to get the fiberglass up and over the keel and back down the other side with all this extra puckering. So I just went right down the center of the keel and from one side down, prepared it, and then went to the other side and prepared it. So you'll see me here just do this one side, and then I think at one point off camera I cut off whatever wasn't glued down. But it's important. You notice how I left it long, because it tugs and pulls and you might end up pulling. If I cut that short right now before, I might end up fighting with an open end. So you'll notice I'm using 2 squeegees holding the mat against the keel while I'm pulling the glue out. Really important. Otherwise, if you just keep pulling the epoxy across the mat, it'll just keep moving the mat down. It'll just keep pulling it off from the other side. That's why I left it long, because I knew it was going to tug a little bit. The blue tape helped somewhat, but having the extra on the other side of the keel helped me in case I ran into any problems. You put it on, you let it soak in, brush it in. And actually you saw me just run across the back there with the scissor, because now it was starting to pull up. The extra weight from the other side of the boat was pulling up, so I wasn't staying tucked in the sharp corner of the keel there. And so you'll notice I cut it just to alleviate the weight of it pulling on it. And you want to tend to the epoxy. You want to just keep tugging on it, pushing on it, because once it gets to that honey stage where it's going to start to gel, you want to make sure everything is pushed into place. So I just keep squeegeeing it and making sure I'm getting out anything that's not necessary. And just keep filling in, pushing in, and it gets to the point where, now here it is, it might be the next day. Yep, this is the next day. This is all dried, so now I'm just pulling off anything that was in the way. And my camera's about to fall off the boat. I do one side and I get rid of any little, because now that mat has a little bit of resin in it, a little bit of epoxy, there's a million little sharp edges, and it can get snagged when we do the next step. So I'm just cutting off what I can with the razor blade, but then I go over with a little hand sander and get rid of everything. Now this is the other side, and you just start getting it stuck in place with epoxy. And I'm super careful just to come up the keel, not go over. I don't want to mess up the other side. Now off camera, I didn't really do it completely on camera because it's kind of boring to watch, but I put 4 full coats on both sides. And you'll see me sand a little bit on this side, just again because I didn't want to show sanding 6 different times. But it's just important to just tend to it, make sure you're filling in all the air gaps. And if there's any bubbles or if there's any gaps in the wood, they may or may not fill in. You're just going to get like a hazy spot. So it's important to fill it in with epoxy if you can now, or even before you start doing the mat, fill it in. That's what I'm doing now on the inside of the boat. There's lots of nail holes and stuff because I faced all the grungy stuff in. So there's lots of nail holes. So I'm going over the inside of the boat with an epoxy paste with some sawdust mixed into it, filling in the nail holes and filling in the divots and the dents. I paid more attention to what was happening on the outside of the boat, so the inside's definitely grungy, a little mismatched, but that's okay because the inside gets a lot of details to cover up. And plus you want a texture on the inside of the boat because that's where you're going to be standing. You don't want your feet to be slipping, sliding. The outside gets slippery, the inside gets textury. And now going to the front. That mixing station from Total Boat, by the way, is invaluable. You don't have to touch anything. Just hit the pumps and it gives you what you need. I use the pump station for the entire epoxy. And then when I do the inside, of course, I'm going to do it again as well. This here, you got to make sure you have enough mat on the opposite side so that as you start pushing this all in, it starts to fall into place. Really important. You don't want to have to cut any darts or anything. So now it's dried. It's the next day. Cutting it off with a pair of scissors. And there's a lot of mat there. I save it, but you know, I'll throw it away in 2 years from now. Now this is what it looks like right with just the mat pushed in. This will get a light sanding, and then I will put more. And this is like 2 or 3 coats on this side. And you can see it's starting to fill in a little bit and getting a little bit more glassy looking. And now I'm just getting rid of the excess. And this whole thing gets palm sanded. And just getting rid of any sharp edges. You can get a nasty splinter from fiberglass. You got to be careful. And now I palm sand that whole surface. The high spots go down and all the low spots reveal themselves pretty efficiently. So you're just trying to make all the lows and the highs meet in the same spot. And if you do this a couple times between coats, you really start to get a nice smooth finish. Now I'm only brushing on these coats, just starting one end and going to the end. One end, go all the way to the other end. Now a lot of people ask me how I was going to handle these sharp edges. I just went right up to it with the mat, and I'm giving my first coat here, but I might also cover the back of this with mat. That's going to be my logo, the end of the boat, the stern, and the engine. I have a little antique motor I plan on restoring for part 2, so I could run it with this little tiny 1920s Johnson motor I got at the garage sales. But I'm just going to have a sharp edge there. I'm not going to try and wrap the mat over that edge. I'm sure it's going to be fine. There's going to be plenty of secure bracing inside. Also, the mat inside will go up and in because it's okay to be a little ugly inside. And now that edge you need to really cut off because it's full of resin. Just cutting that off. And I can't believe I got this far. Honestly. So many points where you want to give up, but you don't. You can't. You have to finish. You have to finish for your own sanity. Finish every project you start. That's been my mantra all month. Finish what you start. And so now it's time to pull it off of the mold station, which is a huge milestone. And here I'm prying it up. I unscrewed a couple of the mold stations because I wasn't sure what was going to stay stuck, what wasn't going to stay stuck. But seeing it move like that for the first time is so rewarding when you think it was just a pile of sticks and now it's this one put together boat. Still a lot of work. I have a lot to do in part 2. I have to build out the whole interior, steps, flooring, seats, gunnels, the deck on the front. Now this is my brother and I picking it up and bringing it over to the other end of the shop. That's my brother Joseph with the blue hoodie on. And now from the other camera angle, it gets a little confusing. The camera flips, and that's me on the other side with a different camera. And now you see the inside for the very first time. Very exciting for me and for you. And you can see all the mold stations. Good thing I put all that tape on there so that it pulled off the mold stations. And now I have to consider we got to do the epoxy on the inside and just soaking it in. Again, such a big milestone. And I got to get those mold stations out of the front. I was a little nervous that I left the screws in the mold station from the very first stem into the mold stations. And that's what I was a little bit nervous about. And so I go and get a hammer to bang it out. And I did leave 2 screws in, but they pulled out right away. And you can see a little behind the scenes here, me setting my camera up for the next shot. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, it pops out easy. But you can see how floppy-doppy the boat is without the gunnels, without the inner epoxy. And I pull that out, and that's good. There's only 2 screws there. I just break them right off. So I was happy about that. I thought I left all 6. There's like 5 screws. I thought I left all 5 screws in it. And here it is, soaking it in. Very, very proud moment here. But there's still a lot to do, which is why I broke this video into 2 parts. But the next thing, me and Mike scrape the inside. I have a few scraping tools. We scrape out any glue bumps. I'm showing you just a little scraping tool I made on in the welding station. All the glue bumps get popped out. As many as we sticking up, all the glue drips. There's tons of glue dripped from the top all the way down to the bottom. And you'll see how I left the inside with all the dark wood faced in. And now we're both palm sanding. And at this point, Mike has done a pretty good job. The whole inside's pretty much sanded and getting ready for epoxy. Just cutting off the stems, and that'll get integrated into the deck that's going to get added onto that. I want to begin to thank Carolina Shoes for sponsoring this video. We're going to actually name the boat the Carolina. And thank you to Type On Glue for giving me glue, and thank you to Total Boat for helping me with all the boat products, which obviously still need to be used some more on this project. And I just want to thank you guys, and have a merry, wonderful Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And thank you everybody for sticking with me through the thick and thin of YouTube and the algorithm and everything else. If I just keep finishing stuff and just keep finishing videos in the way that I started, everything's going to be okay. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So this gets a keel on top of the other keel. It's got a special name for the inside keel. I can't remember what it is right now. But we're going to work from the middle up, and then once we get some epoxy on there, we could stick this one down and work our way up and out of it. And then this will all get trimmed off in a little bit. All right, let's go right on it.
Just go on the material.
Just go right on top of it. Yep. Just start pushing it in. And just be careful. Just dab it on your way down this whole line. So we just want to try and keep that line steady so it stays down the middle. Like I said, it's getting covered with a 2-inch strip, so we have a little bit of leeway. Yeah, and you'll be able to see through it in a couple seconds. Yeah, best to just pour it on and dab it. Try not to brush it, because you're just going to keep pulling shit around. Just dab it. Dab it. That's it. You'll get the use of it. You'll get the hang of it. It's just a reminder of where we came from. Now this is red grandis or eucalyptus. It's the same wood that I used when I did the porch restoration. This actually is the same species of wood. I went back to the same sawmill and got a couple big pieces of it to finish up the details on the boat. And out of this piece, I'm going to get the keelson, which I'm cutting right now, and the in-wales and the gunnels, the outer wales and the inner wales. And right there is the end of the stem, and the keelson is just an extension of the stem, and it screws right onto the keel that's right below the surface there, down the center. I'm just epoxying it in. I used epoxy to fasten it, and then just to give it a coat. And I'm just cutting more of what's going to become the ribs inside the boat. These are going to become the gunnels, and then the outwells. And here you see my CNC machine is set up to cut a pocket. That's how I set this cut up. It's a pocket, and it goes down. Depth of cut is 1/3 of the depth of the hole, and it thinks it's cutting a pocket in a piece of material, but in fact what it's doing is cutting a notch in the material. And now that's what I need to make the left and the right side. So I have it measured to move up a certain amount. I have it marked because with the oar locks and the stations where the seats are going to go, you don't necessarily have the notches in those same spots. So it's sort of mapped out in the plans. And here you can see a nice side view of how those are getting cut out with the CNC machine. And this is one piece I'm cutting, then I'm going to split it in half, and then I'll have a piece for the left and right side of the boat. But this was an interesting, and if you go back and watch my Canoe video, I did this by hand with a router. And there you can see I was doing this in the wintertime. I had the door open so the piece of material can go through the CNC machine and come out the other side. And now there you see I'm splitting it in half. So sometimes you got to do a few moves ahead. You got to be a few steps ahead of where you want to be so you know where you're going. And this was basically because I did it with the Canoe, so I knew this time I could get it out of one piece. And there I do a lot of freestyle cutting on the table saw, and these pieces get a long taper. I could hand plane them in, or I could remove a lot of the material just following the line. And I wouldn't recommend doing this unless you had a riving knife. If you did not have a riving knife, I don't think it's nearly as safe as it already isn't. There's Tony's hand plane. Now I'm working in those cuts that I just did on the saw, and I'm just smoothing them in. So those long tapers become nice gradual tapers. Get rid of all the saw blade marks, which is what I'm doing there. And here you can see, this is a mistake I made on the Canoe early on. Although this has much more gentler curves, the Canoe had some more severe curves, so it was hard to lay it in from one end and have it all the way laid up at the other end without clamping it as you go for good, instead of clamping it and undoing it. Here, all these clamps are just to get that measurement and that mark. I'm able to cut it right in place and trim it a couple times. And now I'm going for the glue up. Now that I'm confident that I got my sizes all mapped out, and I'm going with Total Boat Epoxy. And I'm wearing my Golden Protective Surfaces gloves, which are nice because you can take them on and off without ripping them. They're really durable. Golden Protective Surfaces. And now I'm gluing up the other side. The whole time epoxy's running everywhere, but you do have some open work time with it. Once you get it all in place, you could then go back and wipe it off. If you had alcohol, you could wipe it off with alcohol. But more than likely, it's still sticky enough. It's not sticky enough that you can't just wipe it off. Now it's a few hours later, maybe the next day, and I'm taking all the clamps off. Just making sure that I got good adhesion, which of course I do. But you see how many clamps you need. You just don't know what you need until you need them. So many clamps. And now I'm going to get ready to cut the material for the outside. Here I cut them already. I tapered them, and now I'm putting some texture on the upper part. Putting some epoxy on there. So I roughed up that epoxy on the outside edge of the boat. And now here we go. I'm just clamping this all in place. And with those ribs on the outside and this rib on the outside and the rib on the inside, this is very, 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 very sturdy. It's amazing how much stronger the boat gets with just having those inside and outside. And those scuppers, that's what those holes are called. They're scuppers. And that's so when the boat does have water in it and you turn it on its side, the water will gush out of those holes. Scuppers on the inwells. And now it's time to make the deck. And how do you get that perfect shape of the deck? I just make a tape pattern. And then I use a brazing rod from the welding table to give myself a nice perfect gradual curve. And that's just a piece of filler rod. And I Sharpie line that so I know where to go. And then I just cut out that tape with an X-Acto knife, and I have a perfect pattern that will fit right back in there. Cut it out of some 1/2-inch plywood. That becomes my template for making what is called the deck. And it creates a tremendous amount of strength there at the front of the boat. Sort of like what some bigger boats would call the breast hook. And now I'm milling up some more of the floorboards from the front porch. And I'm just trying to make a starburst pattern that comes off of the apex of the tip of the boat. Now I'm freestyle cutting some of these straight shapes on the crosscut sled. I'd only recommend somebody with experience do that. Now I'm building up this sort of starburst shape all from the tip and freestyling some of these cuts because I know that I'll go over to the jointer and clean them up. And I could use the bandsaw, but I'm getting nice long straight cuts. Now on the jointer I have about a 1 or 2 degree curve on there, so when I plane both sides and I bring them together, you could see how it's starting to make an arch. And that's the goal, is to make an arched deck top there. And you see how I tape one side and then just pivot it, use black tape as my glue clamp. And here I'm just moving further along, adding a little bit over several hours, maybe even the next day. And now I have enough of a piece to cut my deck out of. And you saw I just did a rough cut to get rid of some of the scrap. And now this is my deck. It needs a lot of work to get to fit in there perfectly. And I'm hand planing and making notes each time I give it a dry fit. Every time making more notes, looking for where there's gaps, where there's touches. It became a hot day. The whole while just looking for the fit up, trying to get the better fit up. And now I finally got the fit up I want. You can see that. Plenty of room for epoxy, but at the same time nice and tight, no air gaps. And I end up working that nose down a little bit. Hand planing the curve so it's nice and sexy. And I just built up some epoxy on the inside and the outside for strength. This is primarily just to give it some more rigidity while I'm working on it. I thought to mesh it. I did not mesh it. I wish I would have at this point, but I guess I can go back and do that anytime. Now just sanding away and building back up. My mirror braid grinder with the big giant flywheel on it is amazing for this exact task right here. Getting a nice beautiful fair curve on the front of the deck makes it look nice and sexy. And just putting some epoxy on there and then doing my fit up. I fit them up and getting that little pull in right there really makes all the world of difference. Now I'm going over to my beautiful piece of Doug fir. This also I purchased from First Cut. And out of this I'm going to make all the other parts for the boat. First up are all these braces that go around. Right now these are going to go on the transom and the very back, the 3 sides on the transom. The bottom, middle, and the left and right sides. Just bandsawed them up and then really just took them over to the disc sander and got them in pretty good shape. But what I needed, I think that's the one I need twice, so I just cut it in half. And I have one for the left and one for the right. Now that might be the big one that goes on the bottom. It's the other two. Yep, there it is. And then a lot of times I just make a decision right at the bandsaw. I could always fix it later if it's a little off. And I'm just getting that epoxy glue in there right there. That's the Thixo from Total Boat. And that's how I glued on all these parts. And I did follow up with a screw in some cases. But the Thixo got me started in every one of these instances. You'll notice that piece I have going all the way across from one side to the other. That helps keep those tangents so that even though they're on either side of the boat, the tangency from all the way across, it telegraphs through. Now I'm getting ready to make the seats. And I take this Doug fir, I split it in half on the big bandsaw, throw it through the planer a few times, and I end up with about a 3/4 inch piece for the seat. It's not wide enough, so I do need to scab it together with some domino joints. And here we go, just cutting everything to size. Domino joining it all together. If you don't know the domino joiner, it's a Festool that creates these little tombstone shapes that go inside. Basically creates a floating tenon, a pocket for a floating tenon. The tenons all come in a big box like screws, and then you just hammer them into your glued in holes and then tap it together. It's like a biscuit joiner, but more expensive and works better. You could do a dry fit with the dominoes and everything will stay together. And here we go, just making up the right depth of the seat. And now these are the little knee braces that I'm making on the bandsaw. Here they come. These little knee braces are going to be what supports the seat when it interacts with the wall of the boat. And I need one set for the forward seats and one set for the back seats. And again, I just make my profiles based on some cardboard templates I made off camera. And then here I just make a quick decision, split them in half, and then I take them over to the disc sander and I get them all chooched into the right shape. Which they have some compound bevels on them, and here you can see. All right, these are some critical steps for me. I was able to make the seat risers, and now these are the templates that are going to become the seats. I had to take the time and figure out the relationship to the straight part of the board to the curved part of the sidewall. And by taking my time and doing these templates, I'm going to be able to know exactly how to cut these blanks out to fit inside the boat with very little guessing. Be able to pop these out and then use these as my templates. Again, this is glued to this at each side, and straight lines on the ruler will fill in the in-between. So instead of using a full piece of material to make the seat templates, I just used that rib across. The critical measurement was the angle that I'm drafting right there with the pencil. Now once I cut those profiles out, I put some paint on the wood just to keep it from cupping. When I glued it up, it was starting to cup a little bit. So once I cut out those profiles, I still need to get them to fit into the bevel of the boat. As you notice, my templates are only 1/4 inch long. So I take these 3/4 inch planks and using some hand planes, I get them close and then just get a fine tuning with the belt sander. And once I get them to live in place, I know I'm good to go. And I did use a level across the beam of the whole boat just to make sure that everything kind of lived where it was supposed to, so everything was level in space. Both seats in the middle and the seats at each severe end of the boat. Now I'm using the Total Boat Thick Sew to put a little rib, glue it to the boat itself, and then I'll put some screws down through the seat planks. But in the meantime, I'm gluing that right to the wall of the boat with some Thick Sew. And then in a few minutes, once that's all cured, well, a few minutes in the edit, but it was really the next day in real life. Now this is going to be the rib that carries the very back seat near the transom. And using just some stuff to keep it rigged in space while the epoxy dried. Again, Thick Sew. And I put ribs in every direction. So then I just set some brass screws. And I just didn't want any cracking to happen, so I left the seats just screwed down. So they are glued to the little risers or the little knee braces, but they're only screwed to the ribs that are glued to the boat. Does that make sense? Maybe, maybe not. But I wanted the wood to be able to breathe a little bit. By the time I end up in the water, everything gets epoxied in several coats of Gleam, which is a spar varnish. And now I'm making up the seats at either end of the boat, which were a little complicated. I spent a lot of time off camera making the templates in 1/4 inch plywood. And now here, using my templates from my plywood, I was able to draw all these out, and there you see. I made my front and my back seat, and now here I'm taking all the planks from the back seat that goes right in front of the transom, and I'm cutting them to shape and size. And you can see there I account for the knee brace that goes from the middle back to the transom to the floor, or the keelson. Maybe by the time I build my 4th boat, I'll start to remember the names of all these things. Starboard, aft, all that type of stuff. Because Lord knows I can't remember it now. And it was important to keep the spacing between all of these planks, so I cut a lot of scrap to keep the spacing between them. And then I use the nail gun to just tack them in place, and I flip it over and I put the gold screws in, or the brass screws everywhere. And there you see I'm going to pull my spacers out. It's important to keep the spacers. The planks might not be exactly precise width, but if the spacers are all even, then your eye will be fine with what it looks at. But when everything's all messed up and the space between them is messed up, your eye looks at it and goes, what's wrong with this person? But when all the spacing is all consistent, it really fixes up a lot of mistakes, in my opinion. Some people might say don't make mistakes, but that's just not possible. Not for me anyway. And so that fits nice and snugly. I don't think I ever even screwed it in. I think ultimately just the paint holds it in place, because I do paint it and then stick it back in a few times. And we got our other seats, and then the front one goes in place, and that's nice and snug as well. And man, what a relief. What a relief at this point. The end is close in sight. Now these are the oar locks, and again it's just that red grandis or the eucalyptus, and they seemed a little bit thick and tall, and so I cut a bevel on them. And here you can see me passing through. I kind of do a no-no. I have the bevel leaning towards the fence, but that's just sort of the best way to make the cut. And I drill a hole down through them for my oar locks. I got the oar locks on Amazon, and I wasn't sure if they were going to be perfect or not, so I didn't glue anything in ultimately. Ultimately, for the boat ride, they were okay. They weren't great. They were a little big. Well, my oars were too skinny, but I think I'm going to make a set of oars anyway. So I cut out this little spigot there. That's so that I can get to the bottom of the oar locks and just tie a string to them so they don't fall out on the water. And with a little bit of total boat in place, I let them dry overnight, and then I come back in the next day and I put some screws into them as well. And if you understand where I put that bevel, the bevel's on the outside of each one of them. Makes the top skinnier than the bottom. It just seems to make them flow with the direction of the boat and the dynamic lines of the boat. By leaving them chunky and square, they just look too big. They look like loaves of bread on there. In fact, they're all still a little too big, but it's sort of what the drawing called for. I did some research on this, and the people who have made these in the past only put one set of oar locks on them, even though the drawings show you can put them in two positions. I just personally like them in both positions. It just gives a little bit more visual stimulation to the boat itself. You know, as an artist, I make these things, sometimes I make decisions for different reasons. And there you go, and there's the oar locks, straight off of Amazon. And now I'm making the windshield or the windscreen. It's really more just a, for lack of a better term, it's just a little support rib that goes right in front of the deck. It goes in that curve of the deck. Now I tried to steam bend this at first, but it was too severe of a steam bend and the wood split, so I just laminated it together. I don't show that in the video. So there's several laminations glued together. And obviously it's much longer than I need it to be, but that was just so I get the nice curve right where I need it. I only ultimately use a small piece, kind of where my hand is there, right to the opposite side. But let this dry overnight, and then it didn't really take the curve of the deck itself, how it's got that dome top. So I made it in two pieces. So once I finally cut what I needed out of that glued up curve, you see me here screwing it in place. And then I'm able to glue right down the middle in the front. And I pre-drilled everything before the camera started, except for that one. And here you see the other. I'm using Type Bond 3 on everything, which is a waterproof glue. And then everything gets followed up with sometimes with epoxy, at least, at the very least, but also always with spar varnish. So everything's protected from the water. And ultimately, I'm not leaving this thing out in the weather. I'll use it in a day or two, and then I'll put it back inside in the barn or someplace where it's protected from sun. The sun is what really kills a lot of these things. It's not necessarily just water. It is the UV rays that just destroy everything outside, and the hot and cold. And now I'm just using my Starrett compass to give myself a consistent scribe, and then with my Hillview Metal Woodworks, Hillview Tools hand plane. I get that little windscreen in shape with a little bit of wood files. And now this is sort of a technique that I perfected using the router without a plate on it. And of course I'm using a flush cut bit on there. There's no other way for me to have gotten that flush cut like that without using that router bit in space like that. And then just hand sand it into place, and now I'm ready for paint. There's only one critical point left to build right now, and that is the deck that is on the floor of the boat itself. And man, that was complicated to figure out. That was one of the hurdles that kept me from finishing this boat a little bit earlier. And you'll notice I've added paint and sanded it off and added the gleam. It's the spar varnish. I call it paint. I've added it and sanded it off several times at this point. And here Mike's giving the bottom like its 5th coat. So you see how shiny it is. We're still sanding that down and giving it more paint on top of that. That's several coats of resin and several coats of gleam spar varnish and the glossy finish. And that's the compound, and that's the building we did the TV show in with the new roadway. And man, I'm ready to be done with this boat. I cannot wait to take it out. Final few steps are making the decking on the flooring. And I was having a hard time making these long curved cuts, so I just went to the table saw. And you can make some pretty nice curves with the table saw. A lot more than you think you can. Again, it's really important to have a riving knife when you do this. I wouldn't do it unless you had a riving knife. In fact, I wouldn't do this. Don't do this. And so here you can see the planking for the floor. I had a really long strip of wood which gave me all my lines I used as my guide. And then I screwed the ribs in place. Again, making sure the spacing's even. The planks themselves aren't perfectly spaced well, but the space between them is. So the planks themselves are a variety of widths. They're all not exactly perfect. It's really difficult to get that nice fair curve from one end of the boat all the way to the other across 6 boards. And believe me, it was a real pain in the butt. But I was able to do it. And now here's the big day. That plugs in there, and then the other part plugs in around the other seat post. And I was able to strategically put a couple screws to keep that in place, which I only need to take out 2 screws to get all of that out. It also locks together. And this is it, ready for the big tryout. More locks in place. I did tie a little string before I took it out on the water in case anything fell kaplunski into the water. I didn't want that to happen. But man, what an accomplishment. The sense of pride I felt right here. And I get to put the Carolina name on it. And that's just some laser cut 3M film. And I didn't put it on the very back because the back gets a motor in a future video. And I didn't want it to interfere, so I just put it on either side of the boat. This way you don't have to be at the very back to see what's going on the name. And then of course I need my branding, and I use my Hillview Tool branding iron. And I'm calling this one done. If you're still watching, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Carolina Shoes. Thank you, my fans and people who have supported me over the many years. If you like this video, please share to your feed. Tell your mom and dad about it. Tell a friend. Thank you.
his people want to go into it.
Oh.
Thank you to Bear Mountain Boats for supplying the boat and the plans. And thank you to Filson for sponsoring this video. I really appreciate it. I started this boat in May with every intention of taking it on the water by October, but now it's November, it's 25 degrees out. That's gonna have to wait till the spring. This boat is gonna live at the Filson store in New York City all winter long. You can come and visit it. Thank you, Filson. Enjoy.